about the regulations that affect you as an airframe mechanic. And first of all, let's talk about inspections, starting with a 100-hour inspection. Now, you'll notice in the book where we talk about the 100-hour inspection that you have two regulation numbers. The first one, 91169B, is the reg number you're going to be familiar with, the one you've been working with all along. The second reg number, 91409B, became effective August 18th of 1990 because as of that date, the FAA completely reorganized Part 91 and rearranged it to make it more logical, they say. But we put both regulation numbers in for you so that you've got the old one that you're probably more familiar with and the new one that becomes effective August 18th of 1990. Now, on the 100-hour inspection, the FAA is going to ask you, where are you going to find the conditions that make having 100-hour inspections mandatory? And where you find them is in FAR Part 91. Basically, 100-hour inspections are mandatory if the aircraft is operated for hire or if it's used to provide flight instruction and it's provided by the flight instructor or flight school. But where you find those operating conditions that make that 100-hour inspection mandatory is in FAR Part 91. Now, who can do a 100-hour inspection? Any certificated mechanic with both an airframe and a power plant rating is authorized to conduct a 100-hour inspection on an aircraft. Now, when you've done the 100-hour inspection, there are some records that you have to make, a permanent entry in the maintenance record, and part of what that entry must include is the date of the inspection and the aircraft time and service. The date of the 100-hour inspection and the time and service of the aircraft is part of what you have to put in the permanent maintenance record entry when you've done a 100-hour inspection on an aircraft. Now, an aircraft can be operated with a 100-hour inspection overdue if that's necessary to reach a place where the inspection can be done. If you're away from the maintenance base when that inspection time comes up, you can go ahead and operate it in order to get it to a place where the inspection can be done. But how much can you exceed that 100 hours by? 10 hours is the maximum time that a 100-hour inspection can be extended. So 10 hours is the maximum amount of time that you can stretch that 100-hour inspection. Now, on an annual inspection, an aircraft that is due an annual inspection, meaning that the annual inspection is overdue on the aircraft, can still be operated provided you get a special permit issued for that aircraft. So if the aircraft is overdue on the annual inspection, in order to operate it, you have to get a special permit. The aircraft could have gone out of annual, sitting in a field where there isn't any maintenance shop where it can get the annual done, and if that's the case, a special permit will have to be acquired for that aircraft in order to move it to a field where the annual inspection could be done. Now, let's assume that an annual has been done on an aircraft, but it is not approved for return to service. It's got some items that require minor repair on it, and they haven't been done yet. Any appropriately rated mechanic can repair the defects and approve that aircraft for return to service. It does not have to be the mechanic who did the inspection that actually does those minor repairs. And if it is a minor repair, then the aircraft can be approved for return to service by the mechanic that repairs them, and you do not, for minor repairs, have to have an IA approve the aircraft for return to service. Now, if the aircraft has not been approved for return to service because you've got items that weren't done that require major repair, again, an appropriately rated mechanic can repair the defects, but in this case, because it is a major repair, then someone who has an IA, the inspection authorization, then has to approve the aircraft for return to service. Because the items needed major repair, the mechanic cannot return approve the aircraft for return to service, the IA has to do it. But again, it can be any appropriately rated mechanic that does the repairs. It does not have to be the person or shop that inspected it in the first place. Now, the statement that the FAA recommends you use for recording the approval or disapproval of the aircraft for return to service after a 100-hour or annual inspection, you find that recommended statement in FAR Part 43. FAR Part 43 is the part of the regulations that has to do with maintenance, preventive maintenance, and rebuilding, primarily a mechanics type of regulation, and that's where you would find the statement that the FAA recommends you use for recording whether you have approved or disapproved an aircraft for return to service after a 100-hour or annual inspection. Now, if you're working with turbine-powered multi-engine aircraft or large airplanes, which is over 12.5, the inspection requirements are different. If they're operated under commuter or airline operations, 135 or 121, they've got their own regulations to worry about. But if they're operated under Part 91, they still do not have the normal 100-hour and annual inspections that most general aviation aircraft do. If you're working with turbine-powered multi-engine aircraft or large airplanes, meaning over 12,500 pounds, their inspections have to be in accordance with an inspection program that is authorized under FAR Part 91, Subpart E. And you need to know that Subpart E for the written exam. Now let's talk about airworthiness directives. Airworthiness directives are mandatory directives that the FAA puts out in order to correct some critical safety problem that they've discovered on an aircraft. Complying with the airworthiness directives is mandatory, and because it's mandatory, it has to be recorded in the permanent maintenance records of the aircraft so that another mechanic coming along behind you knows whether or not an AD is applicable, and if it is applicable, whether it was complied with, so that anyone who wants to look at that aircraft knows whether this mandatory AD has been complied with for that particular aircraft. So you got to record it in the permanent maintenance records. Now, technical standard orders, TSOs, are minimum performance standards for particular articles that are used on civil aircraft. The manufacturers and the FAA get together and they say, look, if we're going to use this particular item on an aircraft, these are the minimum standards that it needs to be able to meet. And from then on, if you're going to install a particular article that has a TSO issued for it on the aircraft, that's what the minimum standard is that they want you to meet. For example, if you want to install a new safety belt in an aircraft, the safety belt has to conform to the strength requirements not specified in regulations, but in TSO Technical Standard Order C22. And you need to know that TSO number for the written exam. TSO C22 is the technical standard order that applies to safety belts installed in an aircraft. Now, supplemental type certificates are gained by a manufacturer in order to make basically a major change, a major alteration on an aircraft. But even if you do an installation in accordance with a supplemental type certificate, an STC, that constitutes a major alteration to the aircraft, and you have to follow all of the major alteration procedures. And that means, among other things, that if you do an STC on an aircraft, you have to use FAA Form 337 in order to record that, because it constitutes a major alteration to the aircraft. Let's assume that someone's not happy with the radios they've got in their aircraft and they want to tear it all out and put in a whole brand new stack of radios, a complete radio equipment installation. And let's also assume that that installation is going to be done in accordance with an STC, a supplemental type certificate. Well, the work would be done using major alteration and repair procedures and signed off on FAA Form 337. But before that aircraft can actually go back into service, it has to be approved for return to service by the holder of an inspection authorization certificate. Not every mechanic can sign it off for return to service. It has to be approved for return to service by the holder of an inspection authorization certificate, NIA. And that covers the regulations you need to know for the test.